Good evening, everybody. Welcome to BCS Talk on the Ivory Tower EA. My name's Ian West. I'm here this evening with Gabriella Liddy, who's going to be our co-presenting with me. Format of this evening is we're going to be talking about the Ivory Tower EA, who it is, what they do, and why it's really important and interesting role that enterprise architects can carry out. The form we're going to take is I'm going to be talking for the next 10-15 minutes, followed by Gabrielle, who's going to talk about her experiences of being or part of that kind of Ivory Tower approach. I see you smiling there, Gabrielle. And and then we're going to open it up into a Q&A session. So if any questions occur to you as we go through this first part of the presentation, please put them into the chat window. We'll pick them up at that kind of halfway point, at which point we're going to hand over to Sachin, who's going to field those kind of Q&A questions during that period. We're also on Twitter, so if you'd care to join in on Twitter side, it's at BCSEASG, hashtag Ivory Tower EA. And so that's the format for today. If I step forward. Really setting the scene. So who is the Ivory Tower EA? I'm not necessarily that Ivory Tower EA, but what I am is I'm practicing enterprise architect with a number of years experience within EA practices, either setting them up and running them or actually carrying out EA. And I say this presentation today is really about trying to explore different ways of enterprise architecture, different roles that we can carry out, and how they can be used within the organization. In terms of kind of setting the scene, as it were, enterprise architecture, for me, carries out kind of three main roles. One is around planning, and that can be strategic planning, so thinking about what we want to do in the future, how organizations want to evolve, change, and whether that's to internal and external drivers. The second part of that thing is around design. So taking those plans, thinking about them and translating them into designs, actionable activities to help the organization move forward and turn those kind of plans into something which can be turned into a reality, i.e. realizing that strategy or that planning. And finally, the third part is governance, which is really about making sure that those plans which have been written, we've spent a lot of time working on, thinking about, that they're being executed in a way that aligns to them, that the designs are being followed, and that actually overall what's being delivered is what was originally intended. Or in the case of if it's perhaps not working as well as we expect it to be looking at how we can change those plans to start reflecting what it is. So there's an element of assurance and control there to execute against that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of, I've been thinking about or planning about how different types of enterprise architects operate. And previously, as part of the BCS EASG, we talked about the corner shop EA, somebody who actually carries out all three of those activities in terms of planning, design, and governance, and provides as a service which is suitable for kind of small and medium businesses. If you're interested in that, it is on the BCS Specialist Group YouTube channel. So have a look in there and you'll find Corner Shop EA under kind of small business, how enterprise architecture can serve small businesses. In terms of today's one, we're actually going to kind of almost the opposite extreme of the Corner Shop EA and looking at the Ivory Tower EA, somebody who actually is very focused on strategy, not actually as less concerned with the daily operations of how the business is running. And as you can see from the Venn diagram here, that Ivory Tower EA is very much right up in the side of planning, not really concerned with that kind of design and governance. But who is this person? Who is this Ivory Tower EA? So if I kind of try and put it into a kind of persona model, and actually when we often talk about the Ivory Tower, it's done in a kind of almost negative connotation. And actually I want to kind of challenge that in terms of I've worked with many EAs which have been accused of being in the ivory tower. And I think sometimes it's kind of misconception about what they are trying to achieve versus what people are expecting from enterprise architecture. And as I say, it's very much a strategic role in terms of what it's focusing on. I'll just try and sort my screen in. Here we go. So from a description point of view, the Ivory Tower EA works very much with senior business leaders, so specialised in that area. And as I say, focuses on the future needs of the organisation. And actually, because of that, they are consciously disconnected from the operational world of enterprise architecture and enterprises in general. And as I say, the real purpose of that is to focus on that strategic side of it. And so if we look at it from a motivation, if I am, say I am that Ivory Tower EA, I'm working in a large organisation, or I could be providing some kind of service to a large organisation. What motivates me? What makes me get up in the morning to do my role? Well, first of it is I'm really interested in strategy. I'm really focused on how companies develop strategy, how they deliver strategy. And so my whole mindset is around strategic needs and planning in that space. And as I say, that means that I'm not actually involved in the daily operations or operations in general of that organisation. I might have an understanding about its, what its goals are, what its aspirations are, etc. But I'm not less concerned with what's happening on a daily basis around that company. I may also be very excited about future emerging approaches, blue sky thinking. So, what could the company be doing in the future? And that could be through exploring different business models. That could really be about maybe some technology that they want to invest in, or it could be markets which are opening up where that business needs to go. So very much I'm excited by emerging technology about blue sky thinking. And as I say, there is again that emerging models, business and technology where I want to go. So what benefit do I bring from organisations as being that Ivory Tower EA? Well, actually, part of one benefit is I bring a real strategic focus to the organisation. It means that actually I've got a purpose there. I'm doing something which I would consider to be very important to the company. And because I'm putting this ivory tower as well, my thinking is unconstrained. I'm not limited by what the company is currently doing, what the enterprise is currently doing. I'm actually able to think outside the box. I'm able to think about things that they could be doing differently. And so actually it's a really great way of, or a role where actually you don't want to constrain them. You don't want to put limits around what that EA can do. And that comes back to one of the benefits is there are no operational distractions to the role in the sense, and actually that's great because again, being able to focus, and I think we've all in our roles on a daily basis said, I wish I had more time to focus on my strategy. I wish I had more time to focus on planning. And actually this role is given that space. Actually, as the Ivory Tower, I am allowed to spend my time exploring, planning, thinking about what the future is. And who is my client? Who are my clients in the persona? Well, actually, my clients are the senior leaders of any organisation of the enterprise. So that could be board members, that could be senior business leaders. But actually, the reason why I'm focused at that level, because they are the people who actually are focused on strategy about how the company needs to move forward. And so actually my clients, the people who are best served by being the Ivory Tower EA, are those executive leaders. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point is maybe sometimes this is why that particular, the Ivory Tower EA gets misunderstood, because actually if I'm sitting on the front line or I'm delivering some kind of operational plan, I may well look at that person and go, well, what are they doing for my organisation? But the point is, they're not there to serve the program teams. They're not there to serve the project teams. They're actually there to serve the executive board and help them plan where they're going into the future. And so it's worth thinking about who those clients are. And so what kind of services would I provide to the organisation? Well, I mentioned it a number of times, but strategic planning, being able to actually help people think through how they plan their strategy, which is a skill in its own right, and being able to bring those kind of EA models, frameworks into practice to help strategic planning. And that could be things like, enterprise continuums, it could be frameworks, etc. But all of these things will help our executive leads, my clients, to plan their future. I bring an element of that kind of blue sky thinking, something which is unconstrained, something which may be exciting, different, new. I think sometimes, those executives, they like to be challenged. They like to think people to come along and think in a different way. So I'm bringing a different perspective to them. I'm not bringing them challenges around how maybe the company is performing. Actually, maybe the company's performing really well, and actually they're looking for how they could be working differently. But bringing some new thinking into the discussion, some different kind of thinking. And that's one of the services you bring. And also there's an element of described as corporate storytelling. So not only being able to kind of help plan it, help kind of challenge the thinking, think about different ways, but actually being then able to wrap that up in a story that, the organization can be told to other people in the company, in the enterprise, and help people understand actually how these kind of strategic plans will maybe play out in reality, or reality is probably the wrong word, but actually play out in a way and describe them in a way that can get buy-in across the organization at the enterprise level, can allow you to, whether you're in the kind of budget cycle or whether you're doing your 3-year or 5-year strategy, to help those executive teams be able to land that, promote it, and actually get people on board with moving forward. So that is, the persona of the Ivory Tower EA, that person, enterprise architect, strategic thinking outside the box, blue sky thinking, and being able to put that all together in a nice package for your enterprise, your enterprise leaders, your senior business sponsors, so that they can then take that and move the organization forward. So that's it from me in terms of who the Ivory Tower EA is. And I'm now going to hand over to Gabrielle, who's now going to talk about some of her experiences in that role. Gabrielle, when you're ready to move on, please just mention. I'll
go like that.
You.
Now I'm in the Ivory Tower. I can just say, minion, move on, or something like that, can't I? Hi, everyone. I'm Gabriella. I'm Australian, as you can see, and I find it a bit tricky to use a term like Ivory Tower about myself because we don't talk like that in Australia. We find it very awkward to consider ourselves above anybody else in any context. Anyway, once we get over that thing. So I am an enterprise architect currently working for a global law firm, but I've had many jobs over the years in many different places and sort of interested in the strategy role. Now, whether I get to work in the strategy role or not, I certainly am extremely interested in the strategy role. At the moment, I'm doing quite a bit of that in the absence of anybody else, really. So I am called an enterprise architect at the moment. Okay, Ian, shall we move on to the first slide? Okay, so I've got a few different themes of what towers are like. What happens up in the Ivory Tower? So Ian has described the personas and things. So the first thing that you need to have is a vision for future development. But you're up there at the top and you're looking down. So, you're not directly working with people who are doing anything effectively. You're with the planners and dreamers. You need to be able to look at having a vision, and you need to sort of be able to develop with the stakeholders what the strategy is. So there's quite a lot to strategy that is not just saying we want to go to cloud or something like that, or we want to containerize everything. That's not really a strategy that people can relate to. The strategy has to be more like, something that broadens everybody's horizon, like saying, if we didn't build it, we're not going to run it. Or if we didn't, or if we're going to use our licensing model has to reflect the fact that we've now moved on to a different way of deploying software across scalable hardware or something like that. You have to also be able to be comfortable with theory and to be talking about and to be able to link the practice that you're doing back to the theory, I think, because that's what gives you the confidence to know that your strategy is rooted in something. So, you can look back through the, especially with the sort of history of, say, systems thinking, that sort of practice, where you kind of go from, people like Russ Ashby and Russell Ackland and people like that, and Donald Shern, and the thinking that they've done in how to produce a strategy from various people's hopes and dreams. So I think that's kind of the most important bit, is because unless you can produce the theory that relates to the practice, then you're just making stuff up, basically. So I guess what you need to do is to look at that sort of continuation of ideas in a sort of academic sense. And I guess this is where the sort of the difference between doing academic work, like things, where you want to look to the future, it has to have a sort of continuing from behind. So here we are now, and this is what we're moving to in the future. So you want to see that. You don't want to just come out of the blue with something. Like, I think blue sky thinking in some ways has to have a relationship to where we are now. So if you say, here we are, what we're doing now and what we want to move to in the future, not just say, let's all do something. So in fact, I see Paul has asked a question about the confusing vision and strategy. I think the vision is what you're achieving and the strategy is how you get there. That's kind of how I think of it. I guess people have various different approaches of that. Excuse me, I'm just going to have to let my dog in the room, or else he's just going to be barking. Okay, so once. So sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So instead of talking about an ivory tower, I'd like to choose, and I noticed there's some of my former Allianz colleagues here. Gregor Hoff, who was the head architect at Allianz Technology, talked about the architecture elevator. So he was talking in that about being able to confidently move up from the sort of the vision and strategy side of area right down to sort of low level things. But I'm using it in a slightly different context. You can see a picture of Lloyd's building here. There's the big lift on the elevator on the outside, which is a little bit scary to go in, actually. But you could see it as you're going up to the penthouse. You're not in the top of the ivory tower. On the way up, you can see all the different things that people are doing. The way that you can have the confidence that your strategy or vision can be delivered is because you know that below you on other floors, people are working on things that can support it. So there's no point having a strategy that can never be translated into anything real. So this is where I guess I have a bit of a difference with Ian about the sort of total theoretical role of the ivory tower. Oh, dog. Sorry. Dogs, children. Gosh. Sorry, I just lost the thread there. Okay, so you know that there's people down below who are working on the various different things that allow you to have a strategy. So, for example, a capability map or product roadmaps, or, you can see the list of things there. So I think it's important to be able to get out and about and keep in touch with people occasionally, like not all the time, but just to at least know that there is things to support you. Otherwise, you're just effectively making things up. So in order for the organization to make full use of an ivory tower type architect, they also need to make full use of other architects at different levels of speciality, because then you know that you will eventually be able to deliver the strategy that you've come up with, in my opinion. Okay, Ian, we'll move on. So the third kind of tower I'm thinking what we could end up with is a Jenga type tower that is sort of collapsible. So you have to plan, as someone who's this, you have to plan sort of job protection, tower protection. What are you going to do to make sure your tower that you're in ivory or not, doesn't fall over. So I think the most important thing is to avoid dogmatism. When you go and you listen to TED Talks and YouTube videos and things, people can be very convincing about what they're talking about. But things don't apply the same in every organization. So you have to make sure that you're moving with the times and you're moving with your organization also, and that if the situation changes, you're prepared to change too, and not just saying, look, this is the strategy that other people are using, we're going to do that here too. It may not work for your company for various reasons. You have to sort of be aware of what the reasons why what you're proposing might not work in your company. I think Ian brought up the point of storytelling, and I think that that's an excellent thing. Before you can create a model, you need to have a convincing story to get people involved in it, because otherwise, you know, the model is just a picture, and a lot of people don't actually understand them. I have found this to be quite true, actually. People aren't, even other architects sometimes aren't very good at understanding models. So the story helps them and gives the incentive to want to understand what the model is and to explore it further. Again, I think you really need to keep on top of theories and how they relate to your practice as an architect, and to see and to just know what other people are doing in other organizations. So coming along to these talks like this is one of the ways of doing that, but you know, there's loads of books and other sort of discussion papers. And then I think you really importantly to be generous to practitioners, because, you know, as Ian mentioned before, sometimes you can keep quite separate from the people who are actually doing the sort of the actual architecture down the bottom in the tower model, and you can sort of seem a little bit distant from them. And I've seen that in the past, that people who it's said, oh, he's just up in the ivory tower, and it generally means it's got no relation to what anybody else is doing. So that sort of capability model with 5,000, you know, capabilities and many sub capabilities, you know, it's really difficult to relate to. And so to explain it to people and to be able to talk to different people at different levels, that's the architecture elevator way, is the best way of doing it. So to remember that not everybody can understand your models, and even senior executives and things they often don't understand IT at all, do they? They just think it's a great pit that money goes into, and sometimes that's the case. But you just have to be nice and kind to them, because you can explain things, but you can't understand it for them. And so you have to think of good ways to explain stuff. To finish up is a little phrase from it's the first chapter of Brideshead Revisited. It's in Arcadia Ego. It means, if you don't know, it means, and there's always you there. So wherever you go, you're there. So, you know, you put your spin on it as well, and your personality and your, and just, you know, your experience you bring to it. So to make sure that you do maintain your own personality as you're working, because that's why people ask you to do things, not to try and be like everybody else. So that's my take on the being an enterprise architecture in the enterprise elevator / ivory tower.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Should we go with the question and answers now? Yeah. So we have first question coming from Tim King. How do you counteract negative images of the term Ivory Tower EA? So over to you, Ian. Would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, I think some of this comes down to who your client is, and I suppose it's thinking about you know, who is that client, and therefore how do you counteract that negative image. And I say often I hear people talk about what we described as the Ivory Tower EA, and they're not actually the customer or the client that EA is targeting. As I mentioned earlier, you really, when you're in this position, you're focused more on your kind of senior managers, executive teams in the company, as opposed to your operational teams. Now, I think what needs to be done here is actually interesting, because you need to use that storytelling to actually articulate why you are the architect in that position, and as opposed to you know, the person on the ground fixing stuff. So I think it is, there is an element here of, if you're trying to break down that kind of negative view, actually slightly in contradiction to being in the ivory tower, is getting out and speaking to people to understand maybe what their roles are, and also explaining what your role is around that. But always bear in mind that actually you're trying to create a strategy or something which is more futuristic for the company. Gabriella, I'll probably pass across to you actually to answer that.
Well, it is usually, people only say it in a negative way, don't they? That's why I was thinking you could use the architecture elevator way of talking about it, instead, saying you go up to the top, but you can sort of come down a bit to talk to other people, and just turn it around like that. Say sometimes when you're when you're doing strategy stuff, you're up at the top, and then you're just coming down to the different floors. That's all.
Yeah, and I think it's that thing, isn't it? Is it, if I actually went and spoke to a number of executives who I've done work for, they would probably actually say, actually, that's really appreciative. And it's probably why we see a lot of kind of consultants coming into organizations. And I think actually, if you're doing a good job, you would be working with those consultants and that kind of thing. So it kind of comes down to, who are you trying to explain that role to?
Okay.
Back to you, Sasha.
So we have the next question from Paul Montag. Clarify the difference between vision and strategy. I think Mike Broom did answer to look up the VMOS model, but any comments from your side? So maybe Gabby, you can answer, or
oh, well, I think I talked about that during the talk, wasn't it? To say the vision. When I talk about it, I think the vision is where you want to go, and the strategy is how you get there, for me.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think actually often the vision is fairly well set and doesn't change that often, where what you will find is your strategy will flex and alter as you move forward. So they are two different things.
Okay. So we have the next question from Joe Lewis. Does Ivory Tower role still applies if organization is committed to like DevOps, like fail fast, or that kind of approach?
It's a good question. It is very difficult to know. It is very difficult to apply things. I mean, when you do something like you're in Scrum or some other technique like that, how do you work with a 2-week sprint or even a 1-month sprint or stuff, and how to go? And I guess what you have to think of is, what will you give? I mean, it's the difference between delivery too, isn't it, and an overall direction. So you've got an overall direction that you're doing in the sort of up at the top in the strategy part, and that has to be delivered lower down. Now, we're not really talking about delivery at the moment, so I guess it is certainly a tricky one, and that a lot of the sort of TOGAF sort of style stuff doesn't quite address at this point. And a lot of businesses don't really address how to do things like this either, do they? I mean, you know, how do you build things? How do you pay for services from a consultant thing on a 2-week basis? It's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, I've probably got a slightly different take on it, Gabrielle. And I suppose for me, it comes back to the original definition I see of an Ivory Tower EA, is where actually they're very focused on strategy. And actually, I would say, well, in an organization which is committed to DevOps, of course that Ivory Tower EA can exist, but they would not exist within the DevOps community. They would not exist within the DevOps practice, as it were. But they may well have been there right at the start of that kind of whole conception about moving towards being a DevOps organization. They may have been working with people to say, well, actually, you know, I predict in the next 5-10 years that all organizations will move to DevOps organizations. And so they very much may have been there at the very germination of an organization moving into DevOps. I think it's this kind of perception of that role is actually, a DevOps is about delivery, and therefore the if you think about the life cycle of, systems, and I mentioned earlier around, you kind of got that planning, design, governance. When you're moving into that DevOps world, you're actually over in that design, you're in that kind of delivery side. And so therefore the Ivory Tower EA has stepped away from that. They're probably trying to see what are we going to do once DevOps is considered the norm, as it were. What's going to be the replacement to DevOps. So I would say that there definitely is a role for that Ivory Tower EA. I think probably the size of the organisation, though, will perhaps maybe say whether that person is a permanent person in the organisation or whether they're a consultant. So I would certainly in a small organisation, I wouldn't expect there to be an Ivory Tower EA, because actually, how much strategy planning can they do? Wherein maybe a large multi-national or multi-global organisation, there's much more scope and space for that role to exist. And I think sometimes it's down to where you would like to be as an EA, and perhaps where the organisation offers you those opportunities.
Okay, we have the next question again from Paul Montag. This is related to your comments, like a convincing story to be told. So Paul wants to know any approaches that you can suggest for telling a convincing story. You both talked about storytelling is very important. Maybe just slightly off topic, but
I mean, I could probably do a completely different session on storytelling. I think for me, what's probably the most important thing when you think about creating that story and delivering it is just think about who you are telling the story to. So let's maybe pick on that kind of DevOps example we just chatted about. If I was coming to the senior leaders and I was saying, look, I think the future is DevOps, I wouldn't go in there and talk about, actually, I need to build release pipelines, or I need this technology, or I need to do automation, all that kind of thing. Because actually, as an executive, I'm less interested in that. You will get some, obviously, who would be. But actually, what they want to be hearing about is what DevOps does to the organization. It makes it be able to respond quicker to change. It makes it actually, if it's done in a really good way, it makes actually you as more consistent in terms of what you deliver. And I think that's probably the key, is when you're starting to think about that story, think about who the audience is you are, and think about like the few kind of pertinent elements of that they will be interested in. And I often see people trying to sell a piece of technology as opposed to what that technology would do for the organization, what it would do for the enterprise. So focus on what it would do for it, not necessarily what it is. And I kind of see that as actually, once you've convinced them that's the right thing, then it can kind of move to that next phase. I mean, Gabrielle, what's your thoughts?
Okay. So an example of that is talking about variety. So where do you want variety in your organization? Do you want to have 6 different enterprise grade software products like Salesforce, I don't know, can't think of any off the top of my head, SAP, all those things that all sort of overlap in their use cases? So do you want to have variety with those with products, or do you want to have variety with use cases that you develop? I think this is an interest. So you have to choose how the story will fit into your particular case. But by saying we're spending all our time managing our vendor relationships with all our different products and the different data centers that we're relating to and the different support agreements and everything, means you haven't got probably enough time to focus on what you're actually providing for the users. If you think instead of saying we're going to have less variety in the sort of IT end, but more variety in the in what we offer to our users, so that they can do more things with a more sort of regular, smaller sort of base of components underneath, you can sort of say, well, where we want to spend the money. Do we want to spend the money at the top where people can see it? Or are we spending money because we've let a couple of people choose to buy big systems that use up all of our money? and all of our staff maintaining it. So for me, that's been a successful storytelling thing, to come up with something that illustrates that you can have sort of a variety sort of pyramid going like this, with it's pretty standard at the top, but we've got a lot of different things that have to be interrelated to do it. Or you can say we've got a standard at the bottom, and we've got lots of different things implemented on the top. So inverted sort of pyramids. So that's an example I've used.
Okay. So we have the next question from Mike Broomhead. In terms of any constraints for Ivory Tower EA, in which part of the life cycle there is any constraint, whether it's strategy, design, governance as a top layer, or the second level of detail, vision objectives, strategy tactics, or disciplines of tech layer, or is the constraint equal among both the layers? I mean, how do you see it? Are there any specific constraints when we?
Yeah, that's right. I'm just looking at Mike's question. I'm kind of formulating. I mean, from a life cycle constraint, I think it depends on the maturity of the organisation. Obviously, if you're in a company or you're working with someone who actually doesn't think strategically, or maybe more is focused on that kind of delivery side in terms of design and governance, that will be quite a challenge for that EA, because actually they're not delivering what their client is expecting. And this is why I talk about clients, is so it's actually we deliver to our clients, and you've got to think about what they are. So that would be a challenge, but I think it's probably more a case of you not necessarily got the right client for you. You need to kind of work with the right client, and where that might be. And again, level of detail. Interesting. I think vision, mission, objective, strategy, tactics, discipline. I would see an Ivory Tower EA as being able to speak to all of those areas, to be honest, to different levels of detail. And I think that's the thing. Maybe if you were getting more into kind of tactics, disciplines, etc., you would be looking more towards your engineering teams, or more detailed specialists, maybe solution architects in the organisation. But certainly those first few bits around the vision, mission, objective, strategy, I would see it there. I think one thing which might be I wouldn't call it a constraint, it's more of a challenge, is finding the right level of detail for your clients. It's quite easy to spend a lot of time and produce a lot of information, and it could be slide decks, it could be frameworks, it could be models, and try and present that as your work. Often people are more interested, certainly at the SWE, as well, actually, I just want to see what it looks like. I'm not necessarily interested in, the 15 layers of analysis that you've done to get to the thing. I want to see just the thing. So I think sometimes you've got to apply almost like a constraint to yourself around, well, I should only show the most pertinent thing to my client, much like the storytelling thing. You could have spent a great amount of time building out characters, around kind of personas, could be around different ways that the organization would evolve. When it comes to telling the story, you don't spend the first half hour describing all the research you did to create the story. You go straight to the story and you tell the story. And I think that's probably where it is. But I think, coming back to that kind of life cycle thing, think about your client, make sure they're interested in strategy, and focus on those kind of top level things with the right level of detail for them. Gabrielle. You're on mute, by the way.
So I don't think I've got anything else to add.
Okay. So we have the next question from Tim King. How do the Ivory Tower Ivory Tower EA ideas compare to the P3 framework, like project portfolio program management? Any relationship to that?
From my point of view, I think it's a different. It plays in a slightly different place. It certainly plays around portfolio, and I've certainly worked at places where as an architect, I've worked very closely with the portfolio team, particularly around developing strategies, roadmaps, around where the future needs to be. So I would see this particular role as focused a bit more on the portfolio side, and less really around program and project, and actually perhaps even to the point where they don't really work with program and projects at all, because actually that's not the space they're in, or they should be in. And actually, when I was, speaking from experience, being in that portfolio role, one of the actual challenges I did find there was people were expecting me, some people were expecting me to kind of get involved in program and portfolio, where actually my clients at the time, were the complete opposite. And they're saying, look, we don't want you involved in that because we know that's going to be a drag on your time. You're not going to be able to focus on what we're actually asking for you around setting that strategy for us and working with us around the future thinking. So I think, if you were trying to think about how the Ivory Tower EA would fit into that kind of framework, you need to be looking at the kind of portfolio end and seeing how they can support the kind of portfolio process.
Yeah, I just sort of thought that the strategy thing is above that, and from the strategy you develop the P3M that sets up their portfolios and the programs. And in fact, it could even be the strategy about what portfolios to have, couldn't it? Because you know, once you have a strategy, it's great to develop a strategy because there's a lot of thinking in it, and you know, and there's lots of kind of collaboration around it. But once you've got the strategy, presumably that's your strategy that you're sticking with, and then it can be, you can find that it's a bit limiting for you once you've got it, that you know you've chosen this strategy, and then people say, oh, but we want to do something else. You say, well, you can't, because this is our strategy, we're doing that. If you're going to diverge from the strategy, then there's going to have to be some sort of you know, fixing technical debt, or not so much technical debt, but strategic debt, I suppose, if you're going to sort of tactically do something other than the strategy. So yeah, I think the strategy derives what the portfolios are.
Okay, we have the next question from Richard H. Does confidentiality plays a big role? So for example, if business leaders have a secret direction, they ask EA to do a Ivory Tower support function, and that EA is expected to conceal the direction and all the information that they are getting. So how much confidentiality is important in Ivory Tower's EA role?
That's called Secret Squirrel EA. Ian will be addressing that in the future.
When I can talk about it. For me personally, I think it's actually a really important part of that role, is having that confidentiality. I have certainly worked on some very large projects, or let's put it slightly differently, very important changes in organisation, where I've been asked to support strategic thinking around the direction of the organisation as a whole, and where it would like to go in the future. And you have to be absolutely confidential. You know, the people have to trust you to do that, because sometimes you're going to put stuff on the table which actually, if you spoke to somebody at the kind of the front line, it's maybe quite upsetting to them, or it might throw them off or whatever. But actually, often a lot of the things that you will talk about and think about and plan never come to fruition, because actually they may not actually deliver what's expected for the organisation or the strategy. So, you know, for me, confidentiality, actually one of those very important traits that's needed for this role, and being able to be seen as that trusted person as well, which I think is important.
Yeah, which implies that you've got to be a bit flexible too, doesn't it, to be able to take a different path, a sort of off at a tangent to what you're doing now, and to be able to work on your own without the support of other colleagues. So yeah, it is. I think that's a really important part of this, because when you're up in that penthouse part of the architecture elevator, then that's confidential, and it's You can't, you come up and down, and you must use the correct level of things. Because I guess some of the things you'd be doing would be stuff that would end up resulting in potentially end up in sort of a downsizing operation. So I guess you have to be very careful about thinking about how you'd react to that.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I thought of something when you were talking there, and it's popped out of my head again now. Gabriella, I think. Well, I remember now. So I think this probably actually contributes to that kind of view of the Ivory Tower EA as being somebody disconnected from the organisation, who's off doing something, but nobody knows what that something is. They're just doing stuff. And actually, sometimes it is because you're working on something confidential or something that you can't discuss or talk about. And actually, even saying that I'm planning something that I can't talk about is breaking confidentiality. I know certainly I've worked at places where you can't even talk about what you're doing, even in passing. And so it probably contributes to that kind of aloofness of the Ivory Tower EA. But I say that's one of those things.
Okay, so we have the next question from Mr. Sundar Narayan. Can we please have an example of EA or strategy-driven successful organizations? So anything particular here to say, any experience where this approach has been very successful, or it didn't went through, or it was just a consulting exercise, or?
Whenever a company changes a strategy, like for example, going from a functional breakdown to say a geographical breakdown, then that requires a change of strategy in the way things are organized, doesn't it? So often the sort of EA side is forgotten about, according to people that I've spoken to. So I don't have an example of a EA driving strategy for over a continuous period of time. Although I have worked with people who say that that's what's happening, that they're being consulted. So, but I haven't really worked in such an environment.
I think what's important to realise is that the EA themselves don't drive the strategy, that they're helping those business leaders determine what strategies they could pursue, and then kind of providing them with the information to kind of pursue those strategies. You probably could argue that most organisations have a strategy going, and often quite a successful one. I mean, speaking from my own experience, I've certainly worked at companies where I have worked with those senior leaders around developing that strategy, the plans, and actually seeing that move into being successful. I won't name particular companies, but one of them was a UK construction firm. So actually, that was a really important role. And interestingly, when I joined that company, they didn't necessarily fully understand what an EA was. When I left, they did fully understand what an EA was. So again, it's delivering that value. But I think there are examples. I think the challenge is the role itself isn't one which stands at the front line. It isn't always obvious that it's delivering, in much the same way that a lot of kind of things like consultancies and advisors and all that. You're there, you're helping, you're steering. The company is changing, and you can talk about success that you've had personally. Actually, the person who, from an enterprise perspective, has created the success is the leadership team, the leaders of the organization. And I think it's being proud that you have supported them on that journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So we have the next question again from Paul Montag. How important is it to understand the strategy that has led the business to its current position before developing a new one to take it forward? So is it important for you to understand the existing strategy to bring the position, or how it is more relevant for existing kind of senior management to kind of get into that existing strategy before they get into the new part of the strategy?
not sure that you need to know too much about the current strategy, because what you've got is what is actually happening now, haven't you? So you've got your sort of as is thing, and you want to develop a new strategy. So I guess when you go around, you're doing your strategy sort of making task, you go and talk to people about what's happening in the business. And I know from experience that what happens is people want to explain to you why the unsatisfactory thing is why it is. So they want to say, oh, it's for a good reason. And you think, well, it doesn't really matter what that reason is. We just know what you're doing right now. And we want to look to see how we're moving forward to the future. So I guess once you start documenting strategies, then you've got a sort of history of strategy that you can understand it. But I don't think when you've got what you've got now and you're just starting from the beginning, say, you don't need to know what the strategy was. You just need to know what's actually happening in order to move forward to the next one. That's my thinking.
Yeah, and I think for me, I suppose it's interesting because we often talk about strategy as it's a piece of paper, or it's a document that somebody is holding somewhere. Actually, often it's driven by the leaders in the organization, and they're probably executing on some strategies which they won't write down anywhere and won't explain to people, but they're always driving it. I think it's worth understanding where a company has come from, because that gives you some insight about how it's got to where it is. So, if it's something which is grown through, I don't know, acquisition, it's going to have a very different kind of headspace to perhaps something which has been, I don't know, a company which has been around for 100 years, like a family company or something like that. So I think you've got to have an understanding of the previous strategy. But actually, you may not need to fully understand it. In fact, you probably don't need to fully understand it to plan out the new strategy, because you're thinking about the future. You're thinking about where you want to be, not where necessarily you've been. And so I would say it's kind of do a little bit of the groundwork, but don't get the full thing. And I think at the moment, it's actually probably really pertinent. We all know that we're in a situation which actually, who could have predicted where we'd be 10 years ago? I'm sure some people will say we are, but actually most countries are in complete lockdown at the moment. Certain industries are completely devastated by it. Actually, it's the perfect time to say, well, actually, what could we do differently to maybe be more resilient to such an event in the future? What could we do differently to make our way out of this particular event and become more profitable or be a better organization? So I think it's important perhaps to understand where the company's come from, but not necessarily understand the history or that. And I think coming back to the Ivory Tower EA is there to challenge the thinking, to challenge different strategies moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, interesting case could be a logistics transportation company launching payments, going into launching a new bank or something like that. So that's where altogether a different strategy comes into play as compared to what the existing organization is. So we have the next question coming in from Nigel Barnes. Could you describe the outputs from an Ivory Tower EA, and who does the EA deliver this work to?
Well, I think that the outputs generally depend on what you're asked to do. So if you're talking about a strategy for some next sort of phase of development of the organization, it really depends what you're talking about. So I think that the delivery is to the senior stakeholders, and it has to be negotiated with them what they want. And I don't think that there is any sort of standard diagram that I've ever seen or standard model that you would deliver. You might have underlying those things that you need to create a strategy. So you might sort of do, diagrams from, say, soft systems methodology or something in order to, causal diagrams and things like that, conversation maps and things to illustrate it. But I think it depends on what they want, because maybe they just want a slide Maybe 3 slides or something. It might be. You've got all that stuff and they want 3 slides.
Yeah, there's probably, it's a tricky one because I suppose coming back to the client, who are you delivering it to? Well, I've already mentioned it's you're probably delivering it to the board members if you're at that size organisation. Maybe their executive leadership team. You may be in a large multinational organisation, and therefore you may be delivering it to a particular division as opposed to the whole organisation. But each of those, the point being, is they're the people who I suppose are there to run the company. You know, they're going to be ultimately responsible, accountable for ensuring that the company continues to be successful moving into the future. Some of the outputs you may produce does depend a little bit on the audience that you're working with. I mean, you can kind of list obvious things, is like, you know, you may be doing some kind of storytelling type document, which often we'll call it a strategic plan or something like that. You may be looking at some kind of high level roadmap type thing about how the organization would change. But depending on whether you're taking a kind of business view to this, you might show it in one way. If you're looking at it from a technology, you might present it in a slightly different way. I always like to think less is more with a lot of this stuff. So think about the kind of key documents or artifacts that you need to produce to show people. Often the work that I've produced has been part of a broader strategy document. So I'm not necessarily writing the whole thing. But I think it is, I know it's a little bit of a woolly answer, but I think it slightly depends on the audience you're doing to, but definitely I'd be seeing in there some kind of high level vision strategy around that, some kind of roadmap around that, but varying depending on the type of organization it is. And as I say, is it business, is it technology? And maybe even some kind of suggestions about how to take that forward as well. So some kind of schedule of activities or plan to fit around that, about how the company might take that forward. But I think that, as I say, perhaps a little bit woolly, but they're the sort of things I would be looking at, and definitely not producing detailed design documents or high-level design documents or even conceptual designs to that level. Definitely not producing plans, technical drawings, all of that kind of level of detail. Maybe not even producing, even if you're doing kind of like a risk kind of assessment, it will also be done at a kind of very high level in the organization. So it's probably easier to describe the ones that you wouldn't produce as opposed to the ones you would produce.
I guess you have to consider that your client is the senior stakeholders, but you've also at some point going to interface with people who are going to deliver the strategy, perhaps, and there'll be, maybe there's artifacts that are needed to hand to them or for them to talk to you about. So I guess although they're not the client that you're doing it for, that's whoever is going to implement the strategy. So
okay. So we have the just last question from your experience. How common is the Ivory Tower role for an enterprise architect?
I think at one point, I think every EA was considered Ivory Tower, weren't they? I certainly heard that comment a number of times. I wouldn't. It's not. I think if I was out on the market at the moment, I wouldn't say it's a overly common role. I think most EAs people are looking for at the moment aren't Ivory Tower. They're much more helping out with that kind of design, with the assurance side of it. That's not to say that they don't exist, and certainly I've spoken to a number of people recently who definitely are that kind of Ivory Tower EA. I suppose if you kind of put it in a bracket of EAs, I probably think there's probably about 5 to 10% of people who operate in this space, if that. And but I would also say that actually, as a practicing EA, sometimes I become that Ivory Tower EA. I might only do it for a month, might only do it for a few days, but I think it's being able to also flex into that space, take that mindset with you, and then be able to flex back.
Mm.
Okay, thank you. So, Kathy, would you like to wrap up today's discussion?
Yeah, no, this has been good to think about this stuff. I have to say, since I've been thinking about this, I've been thinking it'd be nice to spend some time up in the penthouse for a change, for a change, instead of having to be fiddling around with people who don't want to deliver anything. So it's been a very interesting process to think about this, because like Ian, I think you could say I could spend some proportion of my time doing this sort of work, perhaps at the moment 15 to 20% of my time, and it is interesting, and people really like you to have a way of recording a strategy, because not many people are very good at recording a strategy or even have any skills in that respect. And then when they see it written down, it allows them to see, how the strategy relates to, say, principles, options that you've got, issues, and a roadmap. And it just helps them to, to think about what they're doing. And that, I guess, is the goal, isn't it? To think about what you're doing and make it so that you can steer an organization towards that path responsibly.
Mm-hmm. Any final words from you, Ian?
Yeah, no, I say, from my point of view, I'd just like to say thanks for everybody for attending. I think the questions have been really good. They're really good. And I think the whole point of these sessions that we're running as the BCS Enterprise Architecture Specialist Group is to get people thinking about the role, get them to think about EA, and certainly I can see that today. I think hopefully people are thinking about it. I do feel that there are EAs who are Ivory Tower, and I think that's a perfectly valid role that they can perform, or actually for an EA. And actually being able to recognise that we aren't all the same, we don't all do the same job all the time. As the same with any profession, there's different levels and different skills within there. But I say, really for me, it's just thanks for everybody, and I say I found it quite an interesting conversation for today.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Gabby, on behalf of BCS members and non-members alike, for sharing your thoughts and experiences. If you can stop recording, Ian, then we can have the floor open for open discussions and networking. This can continue for another 25 minutes, let's say till 8 o'clock. So anybody who wants to share any thoughts, anybody wants to make any comment, they can unmute themselves and speak actually.